Thank you so much for joining us. Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 828th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege today of being your MC for a conversation featuring Christine Emeran, Chris Finan, Elizabeth Larison, and Svetlana Mintcheva, and Reverend Dr. Donna Schaper. We're also thrilled to welcome poet Alina Stefanescu here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter, and here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but they serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guests and host. Dr. Christine Emeran is a director of the Youth Free Expression Program at the National Coalition Against Censorship. She writes on contemporary issues about young people, social media, and social movements in the US and Europe. Chris Finan is executive director of the National Coalition Against Censorship and has been involved in the fight against censorship for over 40 years. He is a former president of the American Booksellers Foundation for Free Expression. Elizabeth Larison has worked in cultural, programmatic, and directorial capacities for the arts organizations at venues such as Flux Factory and Park Avenue Armory, among others. As director of NCAC's Arts and Culture Advocacy Program, Elizabeth leads various initiatives in advising and educating how to address the presentation of controversial works. Dr. Svetlana Mintcheva is an expert in confronting controversy and controversy around creative expression. She directed NCAC program activities for many years and remains a passionate advocate for artistic freedom and free speech. Svetlana has written extensively on emerging trends in censorship within their socio-political context. And our host today, community builder Reverend Dr. Donna Schaper, served as senior minister of Judson Memorial Church from 2006 to 2021. As an elder, she is passionately concerned about leaving the next generation well prepared for all they have to face. She has written over 35 books, and we are also really lucky to have her as an editor at large here at the Brooklyn Rail. And thank you all for joining the NSE today. We're so excited to hear about your work with NCAC, and I'm thrilled to pass it over to you, Donna.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? All right, good. I'm so happy to be with you today. But the one thing you should have mentioned, Eleanor, that I have written a lot of books, but none of them has yet been censored. And I'm really deeply embarrassed by that. And that's why I'm so happy to be with you all who are active in the work against the stupidity of censorship. And I'm going to turn it over immediately to Chris Finan because he's the ED of this wonderful organization and he'll pass the torch to the rest. Why do you do this? Why bother?
Oh, well, it started in my childhood, and it's just been constant ever since. I grew up. I'm old, right? I graduated from high school in 1971, so kind of right in the middle of a free speech revolution. The war was on, and my first activity in free speech was demonstrating on the mall in Denver during the anti-war moratorium. And I've worked as a newspaper reporter and certainly valued the importance of freedom of the press and before going to graduate school. And when I got out of that, I needed a job. And I just kind of stumbled on an ad in the New York Times for a First Amendment trade association that was looking for help right as the last great wave of book banning began. I started with that particular group in 1982. That was the year when all hell broke loose, with Judy Blume being public enemy #1. Right. That was also the first year of, in response to that calamity, the first Banned Books Week was formed. And that was an effort by American Library Association and a couple other groups, including Booksellers Association, to really show people that the books that were being challenged and banned were not as they were presented by the censors, that these were important educational, artistic works that kids deserve to have access to. And so Banned Books Week has been celebrated every year since then, either the last week of September. For this year, it'll be the first week of October. And obviously, we hope this is the biggest celebration ever.
Yeah, I hope so too. Christine, how did you come into this work and why do you do it?
Thank you so much, Donna. It's wonderful to be here. I guess for me, my first personal experience with censorship occurred when I was a middle school student. I went to school at a Catholic school in the Midwest, and I do distinctly remember going home with a list of books that were censored. And one of the books were on the list was Judy Blume's Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. And it was one book that was actually on my bookshelf that I really thoroughly enjoyed reading, and was surprised to see that the school did not approve of this particular book. So for me, censorship had been on my mind from that personal experience, and having an opportunity to work at the National Censorship Organization Against Censorship became for me an opportunity to help other students get access to books that help shape their lives in some particular way.
That's great. Well, thank you for being in it so long already.
Thank you.
Yeah. Elizabeth, how about you?
Both of my academic theses that I wrote for my undergraduate and graduate degrees had to do with issues of speech, even though one of them was for a human rights degree or a human rights major, and the other one was for a curatorial thesis. I've long been interested in what kinds of speech constitute speech action or political speech, and first became interested in very overtly political artworks as done by like Grand Fury or Women on Web or Women on Waves, which is now Women on Web, for example. And I guess, yeah, where I come to it now, I guess I've gained greater appreciation for the nuances in which art can engage with complicated ideas, contested ideas, and ways in which art can forge new ideas and engage in the political on a much more nuanced valence, and how important that is.
Right. The importance of nuance in the book, right? And not having to worry about getting unpublished because you said something or open your mouth. Svetlana, welcome from Greece, the evening in Greece. We are so glad to see the shadow of sun.
Yeah, there's some sun for New Yorkers in the smoke. So how I got into this, I care about this because I hate bullies, and I hate bullies in power that are exercising their power to either tell me that I should shut up rather than argue with me, or patronize me and tell me I shouldn't be reading something. And I grew up, I have the perfect credentials to do anti-censorship work because I grew up in a censorship regime. I'm old like Chris, not as old, but of the old kind. I grew up in Bulgaria before the Iron Curtain fell. And it was a regime of censorship. And I kind of, one of my most disturbing experiences was there was this book. It was called Fascism. And it was kind of how it talked about historical fascism, but actually it addressed the present in Bulgaria in the 80s. And that book was in bookstores. It kind of passed the censor, and then it was withdrawn from bookstores. So it was in circulation. And my family had it. My aunt, who was a party member, had it. And I said, okay, I was like, I was an adult. I want to read it. And she said, no. Why not? I said, because you will not interpret it correctly, because only party people can read it because they can interpret it correctly. So since then, I came to NCAC after graduate school. I was doing my PhD in provocative art. And in academia, nothing is provocative enough. You talk a lot about subversive art. But
Right.
at the same time, as we were talking about these issues in academia, outside, and that was in the 90s, people were censoring simple nudes, or they were trying to defund the National Endowment for the Arts because an artist photographer put a little plastic figure of Christ in a bowl of luminescent fluid. And that was, a reason enough to call for the defunding of the National Endowment for the Arts. So this kind of, the power of the bully to defend, to defund, or now I think there's a lot of power among the offended to ask to not be offended, and
Right.
that kind of argue with it. Have your voice heard, rather than bully people into shutting up.
Oh, thank you so much for speaking to us from a place and a time when you didn't have to excuse yourself for using the word fascist. That is a very important reminder, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. So who wants to take a crack at defending, at saying in a nutshell what it is you're doing? We know that you're against censorship. We know you're for freedom of expression. We got that, and we love it, or most of us do. And how are things trending? We're also very aware here in the States of how censorship is having a revival. Christopher, you said something interesting to me yesterday. He said this, I said, you said something about the last culture wars, and I said, I didn't realize they had ended. So give us a little timeline here. Unmute yourself, please. Thank you.
The avalanche of book banning in the 80s did eventually come to an end.
Right.
And it's something that I think we can draw some hope from
Right.
again today. It was a long fight, however, and through most of the 80s, and then new issues emerged in the 90s. So there was really almost 2 decades of pressure on works of art and literature, and we are at the beginning of a new wave. I think it's not that censorship went away. There's always been censorship in America. There always will be censorship in America. There'll always be people who want to suppress ideas that they don't like. So between these two epochs, basically, you had still hundreds of challenges to books in schools and libraries every year. But you didn't have triple the number, which is what we're seeing now. Right. So we are, really at the wave is still building. The number of challenges have doubled in the last 2 years, and but I can send a message of hope. We are seeing the emergence slowly of opposition. Certainly at the ground, at the ground level, it was almost led by kids. Kids standing up at school board meetings and trying to explain to school board members why the books that were challenged were important. But we also see a lot of organizational support. Now, we were just on a call with publishers talking about how they are going to push back. We see a lot of organizations forming in opposition to the well-organized censorship groups like Moms for Liberty. But we are really, the fight is just beginning.
Yeah. Anybody else want to take a crack at that?
I want to say something about the culture wars, especially that because I came to NCAC at the end of the culture wars over funding of the arts at the end of the 90s, and now we see these culture wars over books. And I think what is very clear, it becomes, you see how culture, education, the arts are being used as weapons as political weapons. So if we go back to the culture war of the 90s, that was it created, this was about like sexuality in art, and you have all this LGBTQ material in art. How should the NEA be funding this? And it brought together fiscal conservatives who might have been socially liberal, but they just didn't want to spend money on such frivolous things like the arts, and the religious right, who wanted all this sexual gay stuff out of the legitimate picture. You know, it could live in its own ghetto, but not funded, not given legitimacy. So that's actually kind of, you know, I wouldn't say it succeeded. It brought these people together. It brought together their constituents. So then we have 2020, 2019. And we had Steve Bannon, I really speaking on his whatever platform and saying we should bring this to the school boards. So this is like, you know, we want to mobilize our people. We want to mobilize our voters by making them angry about what these liberals are teaching in schools. So of course, was the collateral damage the arts or students learning? But there is a political impetus behind those culture wars. And, you know, given that they're different, it was around the arts, now it's around books. But it's important to see the underlying motivation. And there are governors of states that ran on that agenda around legislation condemning critical race theory as if it's being taught in schools, and LGBT material. So it's like it's more than in the arts and education. This is really our socio-political environment in general, and I think that's why I love doing censorship work, because it's not just doing one thing. You really see where society is going, what's going on.
Right, it's multidisciplinary, to put it mildly. Judy Blume. So a child's author like Judy Blume to pornography, or as my 4-year-old granddaughter says, because she's imitating her mother, she says, Jesus crackers, and then laughs, right? So she's it's there, all the things you're not supposed to say and why you're not supposed to say them. Christine, do you want to jump in on how things are trending, and then we're going to go to our show and tell?
Oh, definitely. I guess I would like to look at it a little bit through the lens of like social movements that we've seen, like in the US, and how that's overlapping with some of the types of challenges we've seen in terms of you know, K-12 schools. So I think you know, if we look back, you know, in time, you know, we look at in the 60s, you know, it was the movement for civil rights. The 70s was the environmental movement and women's rights movements. And then, you know, you can kind of move forward, you know, in the 90s for, you know, gay rights movements that, you know, became more, you know, gay marriage, you know, issues that, you know, were things that were happening, you know, culturally, but then also had ramifications in terms of like abortions, women's rights. As we saw during lockdown, you know, there was, you know, the BLM movement that came, but then, you know, before that, there was another women's movement to expand women's rights. So, you know, with that, you see there's political effects in terms of the rolling back of women's rights through, you know, abortion. And then we've also seen, you know, this movement that's multicultural having backlash in terms of the, you know, the former administration of Trump administration versus, you know, what we see today. And some of that, you know, plays out, you know, as, you know, Svetlana mentioned yesterday, the school board meetings. And so now what we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years is like a marked increase in challenges to books that deal with LGBTQ, as well as social issues that pertain to race, oppression, feminism, sexism, et cetera, right? So these are just some things that we could probably elaborate further, but just to keep in mind that they do have precedent in terms of like the cultural raves, in terms of where we are as a country and why we're seeing challenges to these types of books in these communities.
Really, you're repeating what's been said so far. Is this is work for a generalist. This is a work for somebody who covers lots of different subjects, because they're all there moving in and out of each other around a principle of what means freedom and what doesn't mean freedom. And who gets to tell you what to say?
Everybody has an opinion on that.
Yes, of course.
Like everybody is a potential censor, because like
Yes.
even if I ask around the room here, there are people, and we didn't talk about censorship coming from the left, which has been really trending in the last 7 years. So everybody has a view, and think that, like, we have some established truths. Just shut up about your opinion because it's clearly wrong.
Right. Well put. Your censorship might not be my censorship. So let's get some examples on the floor, since this topic is so large. Elizabeth has done a curation, and I'm going to let her introduce it. These are basically artworks that have been censored for one reason or another. But let's look at this together for a few minutes and just put ourselves in an artistic context as one of the many contexts that are available to us.
So Elizabeth and I decided to do that together because I was there when these things were happening, and then she'll take
All
up
good.
the contemporary. So what we're seeing is, Andres Serrano's Piss Christ, that I'm sure, well, actually, I talk to younger people. I see the audience here is more of an age that you remember the culture wars and all that. But, I used to teach university at 2011, and young people did not remember that. That was already kind of historical knowledge. So Piss Christ was one of the first works targeted by the Reverend Donald Wildman in the late 80s, just before the 90s decade. And through this image, he targeted the NEA, saying, the NEA had given a grant to an exhibition that included Piss Christ. And it's, the controversial thing about this is, of course, the medium, because the little plastic sculpture is in a jar of urine. Of course, you see the photograph, it doesn't really reproduce well, but it's this luminous, beautiful image, beautiful light penetrating this fundamental body fluid. And then some in 98, some years later, 8-9 years later, we had another body, not fluid, I guess not a fluid, elephant dung became the controversial ingredient in this work, which was to be exhibited at the Brooklyn Museum of Art. And Mayor Giuliani, when he read about this work, he asked the Brooklyn Museum to either exclude it from the exhibition or lose their building, lose their funding. They're in a city-owned building. The museum refused. A lot of litigation followed. At the end, the Giuliani lost, and the atrium that you see in the Brooklyn Museum is built with the money that they won in the settlement. So that was a good ending. So that was the 90s. You do have people from a religious background claiming offense, claiming this is hate speech towards Catholics, and wanting it removed. And it was all about religion. And of course, all that changed drastically. Elizabeth, I'm on to you.
Yeah, thank you. I guess we can go to the next slide. Decades later, is where we're going to start right here. And the next several slides are all examples of ways in which art is being challenged and censored in the last year. Right here, we're seeing an artwork by Ben Sakaguchi called Comparative Religions 101. If you're not familiar with Ben's work, he's a Japanese-American artist who's a retired art professor and is still making work now in his mid-80s. The work that you're seeing right now was invited to the Orange County Museum of Art's California Biennial, which opened last fall. And the artwork here, I'm not going to try to explain it in great detail, but generally speaking, the artist is exploring humanity's flawed quest for power and influence. And he does that through many satirical juxtapositions that reference at times religion, geopolitics, pop history, pop culture, and world history. And we can go to the next slide because it shows what was controversial about the work. At the center panel here, you can see there is a tiny swastika, and in the lower right hand, you see another swastika that appears on a flag. Swastikas are used in this artwork whenever the artist renders military units or politicians that were allied with Nazi Germany. And so here at the center, there's the depiction of soldiers who were fighting for the independent state of Croatia, which was a puppet government under Hitler's Germany. And then in the lower right, there's an example of the Sikh Brigade that was an Indian military unit that was composed of prisoners of war. So we see different ways that power is co-opted and ways that the artist is exploring that. So the artist was contacted a couple of months prior to the opening. The museum had concerns, in particular their education department had concerns that the work would be triggering, uncomfortable, or upsetting for some viewers. And so to do their due diligence, they wanted to have the artist answer a bunch of questions about the entirety of the artwork. So they sent 17 questions to the artist. The artist complied, wrote detailed answers, and in addition, made 10 videos examining the details of all of the what he explored in his work. And posted this on his website. You can Google it and see what the artist has to say about his own work. Unfortunately, and nonetheless, this was not good enough for the museum, who replied to the artist less than a month before the exhibition's opening that they had a policy of not showing any work that depicts a swastika, regardless of context. Here we see an artist who is clearly not lauding the symbolism or the meaning behind a swastika. He's being very critical of it. And as a side note, he and his family were interred in Japanese internment camps. So this is not somebody who is supportive of fascism or of the hatred behind this. And yet we have work which is taken out of a major exhibition. And the next, we can go to the next slide. The next three different examples that are shown across the next three slides have all happened on college campuses in the past year. The first two represent exhibitions that have been challenged or protested against by students that have resulted in either the removal of the exhibition or in the suppression of the exhibition. So the first example that I'll be talking about is an exhibition called Taravat by the artist Taravat Talapasand. She was invited to do a solo exhibition at Macalester College, and she is known to apply a subversive lens of resistance to the tropes and imagery commonly associated with Islamic piety and Iran. Some of the works on view in her solo exhibition upset several members of the Muslim student body because of the way that they juxtapose themes of overt sexuality and protest and, of course, Islamic piety. And they complained that the work was offensive and that the work made them feel targeted and mocked and undervalued in the campus community. The exhibition didn't get pulled entirely, but what I'm going to talk about is the ways that the college failed the artist and failed the principles of artistic expression and how they responded. They apologized on behalf of the artist, which the artist asked them not to do. They treated the entire exhibition more or less as a mistake. They they closed the exhibition for one weekend, and because the gallery has glass walls, which might be conducive for non-consensual viewing, they shrouded the entire exhibition in black curtains, which, as the artist points out, is terribly ironic in what she refers to as a women life freedom exhibition, of course, referring to the powerful feminist protests in Iran, speaking out against enforced modesty and the lower socioeconomic, sociocultural status of women in Iran. The university, once they opened up the exhibition again, had frosted panels and had a caution sign on the doors of the exhibition space, warning viewers that the content might be upsetting and unacceptable to the viewers, and that it would need to be viewed with caution, which completely prepares the audience to look for these very things in the work and predisposes them to a particular position. And one last thing I'll just mention about this is that they also allowed student protest materials on those very same doors of the museum space. So while we at the NCAC, of course, support speech and student protest, we feel there's something different to the school's tacit endorsement of this by having these materials be the first thing that viewers see when they approach the exhibition. And there are many other things that they could have done and involving different members of academia focusing on religion or art history, but there wasn't much dialogue around this. It was basically, covered up more or less. The next example, and we can go to the next slide. This references a show that happened at Arkansas Tech University around the same time. This time, the invited artist was Dominique Simmons, who is a white Southern artist who explores issues pertaining to the South. And her exhibition is titled Artifacts. And in her words, the exhibition sought to reflect and grapple with complex societal issues as they pertain to the American South and explore the past, in her words, both good and bad. Reflecting that intention, the exhibition included images including figures in KKK regalia, a racialized minstrel character, and depictions of the Confederate flag. This was upsetting to many students on campus who felt that it perpetuated racist stereotypes and harmful symbols. And they also felt that the artist had no place in addressing the history of racism because she was white. So a student group arranged to plan a protest, and they also planned to meet with the artist. But before either of these things happened, the artist decided to close the show. She felt completely intimidated and self-censored. And though the university claims that they tried to get the artist to change her mind, and they were unsuccessful in doing so, from what we've been able to glean, the school really didn't do much to attempt to bring greater context or programming to the presentation of this work. And in the absence of that curatorial lens where they could have done this, the students interpreted the work as, or the imagery here, as arbitrary and inappropriate and even threatening. The role of the University Museum is to help guide audiences to identify meaning and intent in the works, especially when works incorporate controversial imagery and contested issues. So there was a huge missed opportunity here. And despite our efforts to work with the college to even make a statement about this, in which they acknowledged what else could have been done, nothing had happened. So this work was canceled and these issues never get discussed. And we can go to the next slide that Svetlana will talk about, another issue of censorship on campus.
Yes, another campus gallery that didn't quite do what it's supposed to do. But this is to show that it's not only the woke left that is now objecting and being offended and calling for the removal of works. This work was removed as a consequence of the Supreme Court overturning Roe versus Wade. In Idaho, as a result, there is a act that is called No Public Funding for Abortion. And that act not only bans public funding for abortion, it also bans public funding for the promotion of abortion. Now, what does that mean? And we often talk when we talk about free speech and the First Amendment about the vagueness of the law. So you have a vague law that somebody doesn't know how to interpret. And you have a vague law. At the same time, you have a university gallery. And this university gallery is doing a show on women's health issues. And there are three pieces that are referencing abortion. The one on the right, Michelle Hartney, is actually my favorite because it references a letter that was sent to Margaret Sanger like 100 years ago. And this is this letter of this woman who had many children and now wants to have some kind of release from producing more children and is appealing for help. And the other works are, you see them, they're embroideries of pills used to terminate pregnancies. And the other piece was videos where women talk about their experience with abortion. And the university gallery is, of course, afraid of losing their funding. And they're thinking, well, maybe this work violates the law. Maybe by mentioning abortion, we're promoting it. And that's where I come to my favorite thing, which is self-censorship, which you don't, nobody is actually kind of coming, the police is not coming into the gallery and saying, stop it. The government is not coming in, but they're reading the law and erring on the side of caution because they're afraid. They're afraid, what if we potentially lose our funding? And they wanted the work removed. And that is really consequential because this kind of laws are going to appear around the country. So if they mean that not only you cannot perform abortion services, but you cannot even discuss abortion in whatever the context. I mean, here, none of the work was saying abortion is great. They were just discussing it. So you're stopping the discussion even of abortion, which is really taking censorship to where it was 100 years ago, where you would not talk about women's health issues.
Mhm.
One thing I
Yep.
would just like to add to that is I think that it wasn't even just a concern about losing funding, but violations of the No Public Funds for Abortion Act might be liable for a felony conviction. So those who were involved in the exhibition from the college's perspective were saying that, that was also part of the reason that there wasn't enough clarity around the law. And so they were responding to it in an overbroad kind of interpretation, which, just like Svetlana says, really suppressed even expression or discussion about these topics.
Mhm. Exactly.
And we
And
can
this
go
is
just
a sampling of what we have. Oh, you have more. Yeah.
just the last part. This is to shift the conversation a little bit to show about work that's being censored online. We've talked a lot about instances in which government is censoring work and which private colleges or students as private individuals are seeking for the censorship of work. But it's also happening online, and one of the fields in which this is happening a lot right now is on social media. And social media companies, of course, are private. They have their own First Amendment rights to determine what kind of content gets shared on their platforms. So, they want to create spaces that people want to use as a business. And so they, of course, make rules against pornography and violence and hate speech, which is understandable. This makes spaces more easy and enjoyable for a lot of users. However, a lot of artists get caught up in the algorithms' interpretations of the community guidelines policies. On the left is an example of a work that would not be allowed on Instagram. Emma Shapiro made a transmedia book called Cut Out, and this is just a documentation of that book. Instagram would not allow this image online, even though this work that she made is an award-winning project, and she was looking to share information about that. Despite several appeals and attempts to get a human moderator to look at this, regardless, the artist was not allowed to get this work online. And on the right is an example of a work that has been heavily shadow banned. If you look closely, you'll see that these figures in Robert Woodcox's image have thongs and bras on that are flesh tone. So these are nude appearing bodies, but they are not indeed nude. Nonetheless, whenever the artist had tried to post this image, his account gets flagged as being not recommendable, saying that this work may be sexually suggestive. And so when you think about the history of art and culture and human culture, the human nude has been a source of inspiration for well over 20,000 years, if you go back to the Venus of Willendorf. And yet on places like social media, works that summon the human form in either full nudity or suggested nudity are penalized, and those artists are suffering the consequences. So this is just a smattering of the types of cases that we deal with in regards to artistic censorship.
Wow. That was amazing. Please.
Oh, one thing I'll just add is that one other angle of what we do in the Arts and Culture Advocacy Program at NCAC is we're collaborators with others on a project called Don't Delete Art, which has to do specifically with artistic censorship on social media. And so that's along with our colleagues at PEN America, Artists at Risk Connection and Free Muse and artist activists, Emma Shapiro, Savannah Spirit, and Spencer Tunick, we are watching these issues and responding to them as much as we can. And we currently have a advocacy campaign going on called the Don't Delete Art Manifesto. And I know Eleanor has a link that she'll be sharing in the chat, where we're trying to convene the arts community and art appreciators of the arts to speak out against artistic censorship to these big social media companies, to try to get them to bring more artistic perspectives into their content moderation policies. There's no reason why, from our perspective, they can't find ways to use their algorithms to make it easier for people who are comfortable with seeing nudity to find that.
So I'm assuming the link shows us how to contribute to your wonderful organization. And if it doesn't, let's make sure we get it in soon, just in case anybody leaves early. So let's talk about now. That was a remarkably good presentation of curation. And imagine if those images were deleted or that we could never see them. Imagine what would happen if the state really required a woman to have every pregnancy she had. I mean, what is that if it's not censorship of individual freedom or diversity or so many things that are being claimed? So let's talk about now. I've been saying how much I want everyone to write a book with their life that would be banned in Florida. Just do it, just do it. How can we who care about freedom of expression, how can we help? Who'd like to take it? You guys are doing such great work. How can we help?
Well, we have one thing that we recommend all the time now.
Good.
The effort against book banning generally is handicapped by the fact that it is happening in so many places at the same time. I mean, there are tens of thousands of school boards, and only a small fraction of those are actually involved in these disputes. But that's a lot of people. So
Yes.
So our task really is to organize at the local level, and the best. And that means identifying people in those communities who we can put together. We are a large coalition of 59 nonprofits with really tens of thousands of members, and our effort is to reach out and get them to sign up at a new website called Unite Against Banned Books. And it's uniteagainstbannedbooks.org. It's a campaign that actually was started by the American Library Association a year ago. And that NCAC co-chairs the UABB steering committee, because it's our hope that this will help us identify, as people sign up on the website, it will produce a list of people in the communities where we need to organize. So it's a first step, but it's a really important step toward national organization of groups working at the local level.
Never underestimate the power of getting addresses and emails and numbers, especially when you're being killed by local activity that needs national work.
Yeah, so we think that's the single biggest thing. Obviously, contributing to free speech organizations, and clearly, NCAC would welcome contributions, but that's really important. There really aren't that many free speech organizations working in this fight, and comparatively, NCAC is quite small staff-wise. We're looking to staff up and to be able to help as many people locally as we can. Good. Other thoughts? Elizabeth?
And of course, I think it's from Elizabeth, the signing up the manifesto, signing up onto the Don't Delete Art manifesto. And we also have an action coming up.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Svetlana. Actually, on June 18th, next Thursday, we're having a Don't Delete Art Manifesto Day of Action. It will take place both online and in New York City. Online, we'll be revealing this Don't Delete Art sticker that people on social media can use to censor their work, to kind of draw attention. Normally when people censor work, it's, trying to do so with minimal touches just to make sure it slides by the content moderation. But here the sticker draws attention front and center to the censorship that artists have to do in order to get their work shown. It actually kind of looks like this. So we'll be having a digital sticker that people can apply to their social media posts and to share information about the campaign. And in person in New York City, members of the Don't Delete Art group will be outside and moving across several different cultural institutions, many of which are educational or have a focus on photography, giving out stickers like these and other promotional materials about the campaign, trying to get people to sign up. This is not a type of protest where we're looking to gather the masses, but distribute information. The most important for us to have your voice, to sign on to the manifesto, which we will bring to Meta at the end of the day as a marking point of the campaign. This isn't the end of the campaign or the work that we're doing on these issues. Our aim is to get in the doors of Meta and to be brought to the table to allow artistic perspectives to be included within content moderation policies. So please do that, sign up. And the other thing I just wanted to point out is to speak up when you see censorship happening. So oftentimes people feel disempowered and stay silent, and it just happens. I'm sure that censorship happens far more than we get reported, than it gets reported to us at NCAC. So please speak up. I know we have a report censorship form. If it hasn't been shared yet in the chat, I know it will be. Please fill it out. Let us know what you're seeing, whether it's book censorship in schools or books being pulled from your local library based on their ideology or the characters that are represented in them, or artwork that might be pulled retroactively from a show. We're here to respond to those cases and make sure that they are acknowledged.
And we also work proactively with curators, because a lot of censorship happens in the curatorial process, because curators are concerned about funding pressures, about community pressure. So we have also an organized workshop for curators to help them, especially today when pressures are not, they're coming from so many sides, or they're coming from peers in the community, from other artists. So we're gathering expertise in the field and giving advice to curators as they're negotiating some hard decisions in the process of curation and negotiating how to present work, what communities to involve in advance of an exhibition that might be objecting to the work eventually,
Right.
how to frame it. So we work with that. We don't just work with artists that have been censored post factum, but also in the curatorial process.
Yeah, I like to think that eventually the arguments will win out over the onslaught of, people shouting you down. I mean, the tactics are so rude that it's incredible. And I like to believe that. So getting the arguments nuanced, sophisticated, clear, that people can use is very important. All right. What should we ask you that we haven't asked you so far?
I think there was a question in the chat about the Philip Guston show.
Yes, I saw that. Thank you,
but,
George.
Yeah, I mean, and that's one of those examples of maybe they were not quite prepared, but they were prepared. There was, that was the show of Philip Guston's work, which was postponed in 2020 for 4 years because they said it's not the time. This is a very difficult context around race right now. So Philip Guston's paintings of KKK members would not needed to be recontextualized. Whereas in the catalog, there were great essays. There was a fantastic essay by Glenn Ligon addressing precisely those issues. But this is the kind of partly the guilt of museums for being not very diverse staff-wise. So when you have 4 white curators curating something, it's very difficult for them to defend it. So after a big outcry, the show was only postponed by 2 years. and it opened. It was overframed at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. There was even a booklet by a therapist that you could take and exit a science that you can exit the exhibition at any point. A lot of framing around emotional fragility, and some of the responses of people was that it was way too patronizing. So this kind of balance of how you frame an exhibition, but also thinking when you have an exhibition in a very racially fraught present, how do you curate it? Who do you have in the curatorial collective? How do you prepare the audience for it? These are things that museums and curators are now thinking about a lot, so that they are not caught in this, like, what do we do now? Do we postpone it and we get slammed on one side? Or do we go forward with it and we get slammed on the other side? But my point is that it's not an easy time for curating work that is around sensitive issues. On the other hand, it is extremely important to have this work because this is where the national conversation is. So we don't want for curators to end up not wanting to show something about race because somebody will be offended, and you're sure that somebody will be offended. And there was another example with the Sean Leonardo show at MoCA Cleveland, which and there was some response from the Black community, and Trayvon Martin's mother is there, so she was saying, I don't want my Sean Leonardo works with media images of Black men shot by police and kind of deletes the figure. So it could be seen as exploitative, but it is, it also brings attention to the issue. But part of the Black community in Cleveland didn't want that show to happen. So they put pressure on the museum, and the museum canceled the show. That was in March 2020. 3-4 months later, when the whole Black Lives Matter exploded, and there were protests in the streets, Sean Leonardo spoke about it, and that and said, I was censored by MoCA Cleveland for talking about those issues. And the director of the museum had to resign. It was again a complex situation where the museum was responding to a constituency thought it should respond to, but there were other parts of the African American constituency in Cleveland that thought differently. So you can't generalize and say, oh, all Black people think the same. I mean, that's kind of a big mistake to think that way for any kind of group of people, whether it's like Jews or racial or ethnic groups or women.
I tried for a time to give up saying the words liberal or conservative and began to use the words open or closed, just to find out how far I could get with it. I've also tried to get rid of the phrase progressive Christianity and just say plural Christianity, so it makes room for people. And I appreciate your bringing up the term emotional fragility. I think we have become less and less conflict able over the years and more conflict averse. And this applies to people making major decisions in art institutions, and the kind of conflict, the bullying conflict that happens in the school boards. The good people are being run out. Part of my concern is how we keep the good people working and become less emotionally fragile and more capable of conflict. And it's a lifelong process, as we all know who have tried it.
Yeah, and also in universities, there are sometimes certain issues are not to be discussed. Certain issues are off limits, and that's also happening some with the transgender community, which is, there's a lot of controversy there, but it is like, shut up. If you're going to question us, we're going to blacklist you, and there'll be consequences, and we're not going to discuss that with you. there are complexities there, but this kind of shutting up of conversation is what we're very uncomfortable with and oppose, even though, you realize that the transgender community has been dehumanized, has been denied their identity. There's a lot of, there's mental issues there. They've faced enormous social stigmatization and pressure. At the same time, not allowing people to ask questions is not going to advance a cause, maybe temporarily, but eventually there will be a backlash. And it's not going to be good.
Right. It's the seedbed of fascism to prohibit conversation. What we need is a seedbed of democracy or something like it that allows us to talk. And we need it bad.
We need a kind of a healthy consensus where we disagree. We agree to disagree. We might not agree. We don't need to reach consensus, but dissensus is something that we value a lot.
Right. All right. Banned books. Christ and religion. Art. I love the word. I think the slogan is great. Don't delete art. Who came up with that?
Svetlana might know more than I do. It was the program was founded.
We were brainstorming. We had a bunch of people. What was it, like 3 years ago? And we were brainstorming, and I don't know. I don't think anybody specifically claims authorship. But
I think there's something interesting that you said, Donna, about how we've become very conflict averse, and I feel like you're completely right with that. It's become very, I mean, it is work sometimes to deal and to discuss with uncomfortable topics, and understandably for some groups of people, they might be completely exhausted by that. And okay, that's understandable. Maybe that's not your work to do, and I respect that. I also don't think that those conversations should be shut down because we do become less skilled at responding to them or even entertaining the idea, where also new ideas and possibilities and frameworks can be used to understand things. There's an exhibition that I read about yesterday in Wisconsin at one of the universities there that had to do with an exhibition or a work in their collection that was like a monument to emancipation, and it has Abraham Lincoln and an enslaved person, and of course Abraham Lincoln's like all dressed up, double-breasted, whatever, just completely in a suit, and then the enslaved person is on his hands and knees, partially clothed, and there's like this kind of like godlike figure of Lincoln freeing the black man, and rather than deal with this kind of this sculpture that doesn't really hold up today in the same sort of lens, they engaged it. They brought in Sanford Biggers, who made a responsive monument to that, in which Frederick Douglass is sort of unveiling, they're lifting the veil of ignorance over Lincoln. And then they have a whole other component of the exhibition in which, curatorially, they're looking at the symbols in the original sculpture and how they're explored in other kind of artworks, and creating a conversation about it, how we've changed, how we've shifted perspective. And I feel like that's such a powerful example of, I haven't seen the show myself, but from what I read about it, these are the types of tools that we try to give curators or remind curators of in the workshops that we do, ways to engage in conversation rather than just omit it entirely,
Yeah. I've been most positively affected by the statues that have come down. If you had ever told me that Richmond would take down some of the statues on that main drive, I just wouldn't have believed it. And of course, I applaud it. No, of course, I just do applaud it because they are, let's use a lot of funny language. They're trigger issues for people who are Black, on the middle of the highway. And they say that Robert E. Lee was much more important than anybody else. Or in New Haven, Connecticut, they took down the Italian statue in the middle of Worcester Square and put up a child statue that doesn't look like it's Italian because of a big fuss. I never thought that. This is Worcester Square. This is the home of pizza. It's like everything there. And they did it, and they voted for it, and they did it thoughtfully. But I can imagine there were people who were as upset about that as I was about something else. You see what I'm saying? When there's high allegiance to a certain value of ethnicity or who won the Civil War. I mean, that's turned into a bigger subject than I ever thought it could be. That's what they're trying to say, is that the Civil War is not what we thought it was. I can imagine. I try to be able to imagine what it's like to be an Italian and not see the statue there anymore, or a white person and see Robert E. Lee gone on his big horse, his big white horse.
Well, public art is an interesting thing because it's not like art in the museum, and it's also permanent, and it's part of your public living room.
Right.
And
Right.
also a lot of, like, speaking of Confederate monuments, they're not, kind of, you create art, it could be read in different ways. They're not. They're created. A lot of them are created during the Jim Crow era to send a very specific message, and it's a message of white supremacy. I mean, they're not like ambiguous. Right. So we don't treat that as censorship because it's like when you talk about government speech, the government can speak and can change what it's saying. At some point during the Jim Crow era, the government was saying white people overall. And at this point in history, maybe it doesn't want to say that. I hope it doesn't want to say that. So if government wants to change what it's saying, it could change these public sculptures.
Right.
And that's why we don't, this is not something that we consider censorship. It's a government speech sending a very specific message, a message of racism. And the government can send any message it wants. The current government, it doesn't want to send that message, but also there's been other public art removed, and should it be there forever? Should a particular piece, the Tilted Arc, the Richard Serra was a very divisive example way back in downtown Manhattan. This is something that people living in that space should perhaps have a say in. And I think a lot of public arts programs now do take community input, which is a double-edged sword. That's a different conversation. But it's not like art in the museum that's curated and then you can go see it, discuss it. It's something to stay and be there.
Right. Well said, in fact. All right. Yes, Eleanor. You going to say something?
I was just going to say that this has been an incredible conversation, and I feel like I've learned so much about this topic, and I'm really grateful to have heard from all of you. I just wanted to open it up a little bit to the audience. If anybody would like to ask a question, please feel free to raise your hand or send a message in the chat. But our first question, I think, will go back to GE. Another great question, if you'd like to ask it in your own words, GE.
Oh, sure. Actually, and I had more of actually a second question, because I really wanted to distill maybe where some of these things happen and how they happen. And can we say that the strongest censorship seems to be happening when various notions of justice, happiness, truth, etc., don't mesh directly with any of our quote unquote particular notions of freedom?
Yeah, I saw your question, and I've been thinking about it. It's a really good question. And I think I agree that that when society is when there are when particularly divisive forces in society like we see today, these notions come into conflict, and so one person's idea of freedom is suppressing another person's right to express themselves. And Nat Hentoff, the famous columnist, captured that whole problem when he said, he titled one of his books, Free Speech for Me but Not for Thee. And that's really, that was, I forget when that book was. It was probably 20, 30 years ago, but it certainly describes our social environment today. And one of the ways they do it is, by denying, in these book banning crises is really denying that that the books they're trying to suppress are speech. They call them pornography. They call them, they denounce them as racist, and so they cling to the notion that they are supportive of free speech. You always hear people say, I'm not for censorship, but then they go on and finish that sentence by talking about what they want to suppress. So I think the conflict is particularly sharp right now, but as I said at the beginning, we've always had censorship in this country, and we used to, when the abolitionists began their struggle, they were shouted down, they were assaulted, one of them was killed. This is a long story, and it just should underline, our commitment to free speech, for everyone, including, those we disagree with.
And it's very ironic that after for many years being free speech, being working for the cause of social justice, with the abolitionists, with the civil rights movement, now there is this perceived conflict between the fight for social justice and free speech, especially, kind of the types of free speech that are qualified as hate speech. Hateful speech that could be painful, that words have power. We're not denying that. But I always say with this, free speech is not an undisputed good. Some speech is terrible, but the alternative is worse. If you want social justice and if you want censorship to suppress the ideas that might be hateful, that you don't want to argue with because they really give you pain, then you're setting, you're opening up to a regime where, what is happening now in schools could happen. So it's what we do is, at NCAC, there are some things that we defend that we really do not like. But you have to stand on the principle, because you lose the principle, you lose your credibility, and then you just cannot have free speech for the causes these are the causes of minorities. These are the causes that don't have power. They're the ones that are most threatened with suppression. So it's kind of short-sighted to jettison free speech because some of it causes pain.
Thank you so much for that question, GE. And again, if anyone else would like to ask something, please raise your hand and let me know. Kind of related, I wanted to ask a question to you all, and I think you touched on this already, but I'm wondering if you could speak to how you deal with the argument of free speech when it's in the context of perpetrating hateful or violent or hateful or violent messages or just misinformation.
January 6th.
Right. And maybe this additional part of the question is for Christine, especially in the context of social media where there can be so much spreading of misinformation. I'm wondering if you could speak to that.
I think the important thing about misinformation is that even if it's suppressed, it's still going to find a way to fester in less public forums. And when there's a place where it can be seen and acknowledged and responded to, that's when it can be refuted and taken down and countered with more information, better information. And I think, that's one of
the classic response of civil libertarians to those, to how to deal with hate speech isn't satisfactory to most people, but it still is the best answer we have, is you don't accept it. You don't, the fact that you allow, you allow it to be expressed doesn't imply endorsement. In fact, you should oppose it with other speech. You should, you should lead a protest to demonstrate what's wrong with the idea, and that is really the only democratic way to respond to speech that you don't like is argue, fight. That's the nature of a democracy, and it's inevitable in a democracy and needs to be accepted as a prerequisite of democracy.
Also, to be censored in some ways is like a badge of honor, right? It's like, it allows you to be, in a way, the last word on something. But if something is sort of allowed in a forum of exchange and response, then it gets taken down, it gets challenged, it gets contextualized.
If your heart can take it, being outside, if your heart can take it, if you're outside, I mean, there are a lot of people my age who were closeted, until a movement came along to protect them. And they got hurt. They got hurt. A lot of them committed suicide. It's not funny. There's capacity for conflict. And I just think that, so my story on the road when I was young and sexy and cute, between age 30 and 40, battling the religious right on abortion. And I was even on the Oprah show, and it was exhausting. And one day I just walked off a stage when Maribel Morgan could not shut up her mouth long enough to hear a word I had said. She had interrupted me so many times in a 30-minute TV show. I said, you better walk off, because hurting her in public would be very bad for everybody. I just wanted to hit her. Isn't that ridiculous? But it's this business about, trigger warnings, or my husband's a professor, really wondering if he dare say anything, that people get triggered by what he said, or some kid said the N-word in his class and it disrupted into a semester-long conversation between the Black and the white students that was not usefully resolved, because it turned into a power question. I'm right, you're wrong. I'm right, you're wrong. I'm right, you're wrong. That's just a dumb way to have debates. So I think knowing that we have to fight, knowing we have to organize protests, that we have to argue. It's also, some people have been arguing so long, they're just, that's all I want to say. And you need to appreciate it. And secondly, and more importantly to me on the January 6th question is, I think these people, mostly men, mostly older men, all white supremacists, have had such unresolved grief over their losses that they don't know whether it's shit or wine their watches. They're lost. They're just lost. I try to talk to them. I go down to the bar in my neighborhood where they have the mini bowling and we throw balls around, and I try to talk to them, but I realize that some afternoons I'm about to do exactly what I did at age 39, just walk out and start screaming. But we had COVID as a major crisis, and instead of coming around it together and creating a sense of belonging, like we did after 9/11, like we did after World War II, I mean, instead of creating a kind of belonging that then greases the wheels for conflict, we really exploded. So I just know very few people I'm willing to spend weeks with having a fight. And so I know why they're at the Capitol, because I'm sort of ready to go to the Capitol myself, but on the other side.
Christine, are you able to talk more specifically about the social media component? I'm so curious.
Well, it's actually interesting. In my work, I think Svetlana might be the best person to talk more about it, because directly, I haven't really been engaged in social media in the work that we do with the book banning in schools. So I think perhaps I'm going to have to defer this question to Svetlana, and perhaps she has a little bit to add because she had been our guru on that topic for many years.
Or listen, the violence and hate speech, because I think it's one thing that wasn't mentioned, that we have to draw a very sharp line between action and words here. And we're increasingly talking about violent speech, but speech in itself is not violent. But violent, I mean, January 6th, there was action, and there needs to be kind of a very good response, a police response. Law enforcement is there to control the violence, not the speech. Unless unless the speech is direct incitement to violence, when it's not protected. You want to talk about social media? Maybe Elizabeth could talk. I've been talking too much. Or Elizabeth, you unmute.
Thank you. In terms of misinformation on social media, that was, the question. Social media companies have, there's a lot of Supreme Court cases also right now in terms of what the responsibilities of these social media companies are around third-party content, particularly in relation to terrorism, for example, and how terrorist groups can convene and fester and share messages online. And it's a very good question, because at what point, like we said, with the terms and the content moderation policies, where do we find information that actually, or how do we determine where that line is crossed? It's a difficult question.
And who decides what's disinformation? When you come, especially when you have also state actors, they can say, okay, well, this is a terrorist and this is disinformation. So when we want the social media to control disinformation, you're giving somebody the power. You're giving it either to a private company that makes totally opaque decisions. What is Facebook going to decide what the truth is? Or you're giving that power to governments. And do you want to give the government the power to decide what's true or not? Not only the US government, but governments around the world. So that is the problem with disinformation, that you are asking, when you're asking for censorship, you're asking for the imposition of power. And you have to, and you are thinking that power is benign, it will be acting on your behalf, but that's very questionable.
I think it's also important to think about the context of the early days of COVID and where the COVID originated from and what stories were suppressed and what we've been learning now about what might be the origins, especially when we're dealing with unknowns and new information all of the time. It's like Svetlana says, it's difficult to parse, and who do we want to be deciding? So on the side of free speech and exchange, that's what we would say. There's a place for it to be discussed and examined and repudiated or proven on these platforms.
Thank you so much, everyone. That was really, really interesting. Next, we will have our final question from Fawn. Over to you, Fawn.
Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Chris, Christine, Elizabeth, also Svetlana here. I was very privileged to have known several people who fought incredibly hard against censorship. First, of course, is Bonnie Rosette, who we interviewed at least twice in the rail early on. And Bonnie, as you remember, won the U.S. Post Office for D.S. Lawrence Lady Charlie Lover in '59. Mm-hmm. And later in '64, he fought all the way to Supreme Court for defending his publication of Henry Miller Tropical's Cancer. You know, he was so smart to brought along dozens of booksellers across the country who disputed come together. So there was a sense of solidarity. And he won. He won very simply on legal battles on First Amendment ground. And he did that with also Williamsboro Naked Lunch and among other things. In the same year, I remember also another great friend who was on advisory board of Jonas Makers. Jonas Makers on March 1964 screened Jack Smith's Flaming Creature, and he was put in jail. And so was the two people who were selling tickets, my friend Ken Jepkutz and his partner Florence Karp. And you know what happened was immediately the whole community of intellectual artistic community in New York City came and signed the petition and demanded he must be relieved immediately. That's included Maya Shapiro, Lionel Trilling, young Susan Sontag, Andrew Saras, you name it. Everybody came together, just like what recently that we did when the Philip Guston show was being postponed by the National Gallery of Art. Not long ago, we sent out a newsletter immediately, and we got at least nearly 3,000 signatures signed by very well-known famous artists, art historian, museum director, and art lover, essentially. That level back to the table on behalf of the daughters' advantages to negotiate. So there are ways in which if we can think intelligently, if we can include our friend in the mix, we can do that. We can do that. When I was in college, when I first time came to Charlottesville, North Carolina, because I have a friend whose home's there, and I never traveled the South. I was so charmed by the children who was reenacting Civil War episode. I did not realize they've been brainwashed that early on, you know, and then only through the pandemic during the Trump presidency that I began looking hard into US history, including the history of United Daughters of Confederacy. I wasn't realized that when Lincoln won the war, he did not demand too many legal justification and a certain kind of condition which the South had to adapt itself to the so-called winners, you know, like they do in the war in Europe and elsewhere. So now that we won the war, our people are together, let's go back to normal, you know, essentially. So what I just felt so frustrated, and I believe in this country based on the First Amendment, we had to fight for it. And I believe that America on the left and the right have been in constant friction since day one. So nothing new. And I believe that they both share a common enemy that helped to unify them. There hasn't been an enemy since the, you know, disappearance of Soviet Union communism. Maybe China will be next. It's hard to tell. But what, you know, I grew up as a Buddhist. You always have to have your opposite force in order to coexist. You know, when God say, let there be light, light say, I shall have to wait, my Lord. And God say, wait for what? Wait for darkness to arise so we can both manifest together. And God say, but light's already, darkness is already there. And then light say, in that case, I'm there too. So it's so interesting that the lack of that, but to go back to the history, as you spoke so eloquently throughout. I remember when I was in New York, I was experienced the little bit, the last few years of the Culture War. And I remember looking up how relentless the people who were fighting for the NEA, namely Brian O'Doherty, Jim Melcher, even though they lost in the end, they put up the heroic fight. They fought hard because they were clamping down on everybody. I mean, I'm sure you all remember Jesse Helms from North Carolina. He's the one who started everything, really. But Jesse Helms is not that different than George Dandero. You remember the U.S. House Representative from Michigan, Chris. Savannah, you remember him? I mean, he's the one during McCarthy period.
Yes, he was
That's
great.
right.
He has some great quotes. Cubism, like
Exactly, Cubism, abstraction, surrealism. It all came from communism.
It's like, it's so funny.
Yeah,
It just
exactly.
destroys the human soul.
Yeah, and attacking everything under the sun, not just European art, but the one that produced in America, like Jackson
yeah.
Pollock,
Well,
Griffith Steele.
that came because in 1948 there was a show that America wanted to show its culture to the world, and
Yes.
there were Georgia O'Keeffe was part of that, and there
Yes.
was huge in Congress. There was a huge backlash, was saying, "What are these abstractions?
Yes.
This is not the art of the American people." And this thing was auctioned off for $5,000. The whole thing. I wish I was there. And then Congress did not put any money into the arts until the 60s and the NEA. But it was like, no, we cannot be funding those artists. And that's when the CIA was secretly funding international conferences and things that would promote the US as a cultural power. But unbeknownst to Congress, these were secret CIA funds, because Congress did not want to give any money to those abstract artists. It was fascinating, the kind of the relation between politics and politician and the arts. And then, and then the courts too, the courts trying to define what art is, in the recent case around Warhol and
Yes.
what is art? What is transformational use? Like, these are lawyers, they're not, and they have to be making these decisions.
Yes. But my question to you all, based on what I just say, it's true that however difficult it has become in a way in the last decade or more, I think that the question remains is that what we do, can we have any way to make in contact with U.S. Department of Education? Because I think it started from very early on. Is there a way that, since I'm from Vietnam, so I know before, as a youth, before study about Vietnamese history, we had to study Chinese history, because it's a big culture. It's been in Vietnam for 1,000 years. It's been there that long. So the idea of being aware of the oppression, what about to come upon your life, and the way to think about it is so nicely doable. It could be achieved. I was thinking about U.S. Department of Education, because the textbook for children is so essential. Half of it is from the South, and they control that, because United Daughter Confederacy has been supporting it forever. There's no consensus, there's no interference, there's no critical apparatus to intervene what get published or not published. For our part is that I think the textbook for children, especially from kindergarten to high school, it had to include all the complexity of this country. It had to include everybody. The African slave who built famous landmark in the White House, the U.S. Capitol, Monticello, Wall Street, the Chinese who make significant contribution to the construction of the railroad, and then all the, culture who've been here also that long. They never been mentioned, So if that can be doable, somehow we can mediate with Department of Education somehow. That's something it's worth thinking. What do you think?
Well, I think that the Department of Education can't really tell local school boards what curriculum to use. That's local control. But good news today is that the Biden administration is appointing a coordinator in the Department of Education to work with school boards to ensure that they're not denying people, LGBT people and people of color, that they're not being deprived of the books that they need, and that the white students also need. So, so there was good news today. And also Pat Robertson died.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. That's
So
good to hear,
that's
Chris.
two big victories in one day.
Yeah. Well, that's good. I'm delighted to hear that, because I think it's essential. Somehow that had to put on the table in a, in a big major way. And I know that we are protected and the work has to be done and has to continue to be done. But having experienced this whole entire Trumpian, presidency, I have gone back to study American history very careful. And I think that we're lucky. We only have twice in history that this rupture as profoundly has happened with Trump. Trump in America, to me, is identical to Jacksonian America of 1830s. It's so interesting that they both share common distrust of any form of expertise, aggressively insistent instead of all important functions are simple enough to be performed by anybody, by an ordinary citizen, and in a way, the desire to overthrow anything that represent the establishment and so on and so forth. I think that we can work together if we can bring more friends and different, representation at nonprofit and foundation. The thing that frustrates me the most, and I want to hear you, and we don't have to belabor on this point, but I think big foundation, they create such a big machinery, so they don't have time to come and talk to us about what we do. So the whole idea of philanthropy has been so difficult. What once was philanthropy that make this culture so amazing, to give back, which is something European culture don't have, neither Asian culture don't have. But philanthropy became in such a machinistic bureaucracy. We never get there. We never able to penetrate, meet anybody. So that's one frustration. And the other frustration is exactly what we do in social intimacy. This is what Alexis Tocqueville called self-interest rightly understood by associating ourselves, serving a group of community, therefore serving you right back at your own interest. So I'm happy that we are here doing this, and I hope that we stay in touch and find way to collaborate together, because trust me, I do not want to go back in labor camp in Vietnam. I think keeping the rail free means something. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fong. That was a really great note to wrap up the conversation. We do have a tradition here at the Rail of concluding our community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Alina Stefanescu, here to the stage. Alina was born in Romania and lives in Birmingham, Alabama. Her poetry collection, Door, won the 2021 Wandering Angus Press Prize, and her fiction collection, Every Mask I Tried On, won the 2018 Bright Horse Books Prize. She is a poetry editor, reviewer, and critic, co-director of PEN America's Birmingham and co-director of PEN America's Birmingham chapter. Among other things, she is currently working on a novel-like creature. Thank you so much for being here today, Alina. Over to you.
Thank you. It is such an honor and such an affirmation in a way to hear this conversation today. It matters deeply to me. So I think I'm going to share poems that would all have content warnings if I were to read them. And I'm going to start with one about abortion. And normally I don't explain poems much, but I just want to note the form of this is an apologia, which is the ancient Roman Greek form of I'm sorry, I'm not sorry. There's actually nothing I'm sorry about. I'm just explaining. And so I'm really interested in the way that notions of purity, notions of redemption, notions of salvation have sort of infected our ability to talk about witness, and also affect what kinds of archives are released and how we think about each other and how we assess each other. And terms of purity. So this is apologia. At 22, I disappeared for a minute. I did not respond when you called me. I wanted the death Alabama didn't offer. I did not want the local D&C option. I refused the twilight sedation, the soothe of a specialist doing the deed for me. I have no excuse for what I needed to be guilty. After visiting a former lover in Manhattan, I went to the Liberty Clinic, signed forms, assumed the risks, and swallowed the first pill. Its origins, French, as the famous green statue. I used Mountain Dew to swallow the final pill on the train for Coney Island. I say Coney when I mean destination, the termination of pregnancy, the train ending in a carnival, apart. The seagulls witnessed everything. I stood on the boardwalk, marveling, dumbstruck by dizziness as something left this body, its warmth flooding my jeans. My hands shook like toy airplanes. No doula or doctor or nurse or friend intervened. No expert stood between my breath and the sky, my breath and the clouds clotting, my breath and the unwanted baby, my life and the blood on my hands, the certain solace, a choice I made with myself. I did it all. I did everything. I wore the silver mermaid necklace for years, a souvenir. Now we'll go to something less dark. Why the revolution? There's a series of poems I've been working on about why the revolution. There's sort of like conversations about why the revolution can't happen yet, why change can't happen. It's a sort of continuous discussion that, you know, you hear growing up, and you hear it both in folk tales and also in, so I tried to mix a little bit of the Romanian side. Why the revolution cannot occur on a sunny day. All the books about men on the Danube resemble each other. My grandfather told me to spit in it and make a wish. The choices are limited. The maps dance in our heads at midnight. The borders are scars on the balkanized flesh. The daddies get plastered and pen love letters to rivers on the dirt of eroding shorelines. Only the Danube's lips offer them unconditional kisses. Only the river forgives a man for being a man. Only the river has enough tears to weep for him without disappearing completely. So this is Of Dignity, and it was published in Huzak Institute, which is just an incredible project that I love and I'm honored to be part of. Of Dignity. My husband is brilliant and statuesque when he does not speak. He poses like remorseless lead on the ripped up red chaise between towers of books and dead hydrangeas. Some flowers don't smell when they rot, which reminds me of Wittgenstein's Eastern Front diary, or the war between dying and writing and masturbation. The question of suicide, the way it just sits there. That tweed hat on the floor with its jutting lip, the hardness of an eye who'd rather touch you than it. The valor drafted to fit the worn silence. I'm trying to watch my time. But me if you need to. This is one that's forthcoming soon in a journal, and so I thought I would share it. It's Obad or Obaid. I always say it wrong, I think. Obad after a week of studying Piranesi. The disheveled midnight can't be fixed. The bed can't make itself up. The clay hue of sheets shaped into a shroud, the unbidden, continues to sculpt us. You call me dauntless, but I can't bring myself to touch sex's tombstone or to desecrate the husk. And there is Saint Maximus, nailed to white plaster. He has seen it all, has moved from the wall of my childhood to wait above the beds of my undoing. The long wooden face knows rapture is an inch shy of tears. Near the backache of mornings, the body remembers being folded, pressing send, wanting to be lost. Among love's allures, the iconic music the mind makes when meeting the eyes of the sainted. There is this secret he keeps in a peeled guilt. And mourning, the memory of your lips like a footprint on a drying death mask. I feel like that's 10 minutes. Is that 10 minutes?
Yeah, that was incredible. Thank you so much for the beautiful, beautiful poetry, Alina. So grateful that you were able to close us out today. And thank you again to Christine, Chris, Elizabeth, Svetlana, and Donna for the incredible conversation. And thank you to the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program, making these daily conversations possible. And for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. This conversation will be posted there shortly. And for the past 22 years, the Rail has provided a platform for arts, culture, and politics through our monthly publication and public events like our daily NSE. So please check the chat for a link to donate to support the Rail and our free programming and publication. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Ebony G. Patterson and Amanda Glubizi on the event of Things Come to Thrive in the Shedding, in the Molting at New York Botanical Gardens. We will conclude with a reading by Mimi Tempest. Thanks to you all for tuning in today, and you can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave, head out into the rest of your day. Thank you so much. Good to see you all.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank
you,
you.
Eleanor.
Much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Chris.
So amazing.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you,
Svetlana.
everyone.
Hi, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much.
And
Thank you,
Svetlana.
Svetlana. Thank you, Alina. Thank
Bye,
you, Alina.
everyone.
Bye-bye.